Margaret Harper lived a quiet life in a small, peaceful neighborhood surrounded by tall trees and the soothing sound of a creek that flowed through her property. She had spent years making her home a sanctuary, a place where she could relax after decades of teaching schoolchildren. Her house was modest but cozy, with flower beds bursting with color and a vegetable garden she tended to every morning. The creek behind her property wasn't just beautiful, it also marked the boundary between her land and the rest of the community. It gave her a sense of privacy, a buffer zone that kept the world at bay. For most of her time living there, Margaret enjoyed harmony with her neighbors. They waved hello when they passed by, brought over pies during holidays, and occasionally asked if they could borrow a tool or two. Life was predictable, calm, and exactly how Margaret liked it. But all of that changed one crisp autumn afternoon when an official-looking envelope appeared in her mailbox. At first glance, it seemed harmless enough. A letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, the group responsible for maintaining order and managing shared spaces within the neighborhood. Margaret opened it casually, expecting nothing more than routine updates about landscaping schedules or holiday decorations. Instead, what she read made her heart sink. The HOA had decided to build a footbridge across the creek on her property. According to the letter, the bridge would provide easier access for residents who wanted to reach the park on the other side of the water. While the idea might have sounded practical to some, Margaret immediately saw red flags. First, the bridge would cut directly through her backyard, disrupting the peace she cherished so deeply. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the HOA hadn't asked for her permission. They simply announced their plans as though her input didn't matter. Margaret wasn't the type to sit idly by when something felt wrong. She grabbed her phone and called the HOA office, hoping to clear up the misunderstanding. Surely they'd realize their mistake once she explained that building on private property without consent was unacceptable. But instead of apologizing, the person on the other end of the line sounded dismissive. "It's for the good of the community," they said, as though that justified everything. When Margaret pressed further, asking why no one had consulted her beforehand, the tone shifted. The representative implied that since the bridge would benefit everyone, she should consider herself lucky to contribute. Lucky? Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. This wasn't about luck, it was about respect. And clearly the HOA didn't think much of hers. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, Margaret sent a strongly worded email reiterating her stance. She even included copies of her property deeds to prove ownership of the land surrounding the creek. Still, the HOA didn't budge. In fact, they doubled down, sending another letter stating that construction would proceed as planned. By now, Margaret was livid. How dare they treat her like an inconvenience? Her home wasn't just four walls and a roof, it was her refuge, her hard-earned reward after years of dedication to others. And these people thought they could march in and take whatever they pleased? What happened next only added insult to injury. A few days later, Margaret received an invitation to visit her sister out of town. Grateful for the distraction, she packed her bags and left, thinking a short trip might help her clear her head. But when she returned home 3 days later, she was met with a sight that made her blood boil. There, spanning the creek she loved so dearly, stood a rickety wooden bridge. It looked hastily constructed, with uneven planks and nails sticking out at odd angles. Worse still, signs of recent activity littered her yard. Tire tracks from heavy machinery, flattened grass, and discarded tools scattered near the water's edge. Margaret stormed inside, slamming the door behind her. Who did these people think they were? Not only had they ignored her objections, but they'd also invaded her space while she was away. It felt like a betrayal, a violation of trust. She paced back and forth in her living room, trying to decide what to do next. Should she call the police? File a lawsuit? Or maybe chain herself to the bridge to prevent anyone from using it? Each option crossed her mind, but none seemed quite right. For now, all she could do was stare out the window at the unwelcome addition to her property and seethe. As the days went by, Margaret noticed subtle changes in her once tranquil surroundings. People started crossing the bridge regularly, treating her yard like a public thoroughfare. Some jogged across it, earbuds in, barely glancing at her house. Others strolled leisurely, chatting loudly as if they owned the place. Children played, near the creek, tossing rocks into the water and leaving candy wrappers behind. Dogs bounded off leash, digging holes in her carefully cultivated flower beds. Every time Margaret stepped outside, she felt like an intruder in her own home. She tried talking to the trespassers, politely reminding them that this was private property. Most shrugged her off, saying things like, "Oh, the HOA said it's okay." One man even laughed, telling her not to worry because everyone else is doing it. The audacity of their responses infuriated her. Didn't they understand basic decency? Or did they assume she was powerless to stop them? Despite her growing frustration, Margaret knew she needed a plan. Confronting strangers one by one wouldn't solve anything. She needed leverage, something concrete to fight back with. So she reached out to a lawyer friend explaining the situation in detail. Together they drafted a formal complaint against the HOA, citing illegal encroachment and demanding immediate action. Armed with legal documents and a renewed sense of determination, Margaret prepared to take on the organization that had disrupted her life. Little did she know, the real drama was only beginning. Margaret's frustration was at an all-time high. The bridge stood like a stubborn intruder, refusing to budge despite her protests. It wasn't just the physical structure that bothered her. It was the way the HOA had bulldozed over her rights and treated her concerns as if they were irrelevant. Every time she looked out her window and saw people casually walking across her property as though it belonged to them, her stomach churned. She felt powerless. But deep down, she knew she couldn't let this injustice slide. She had worked too hard for her little slice of peace to let anyone take it away. The lawyer she consulted gave her some hope. He explained that the HOA's actions were not only disrespectful but also legally questionable. Building on private property without permission was a clear violation of her rights, and there were steps she could take to hold them accountable. Margaret liked the sound of that, accountability. But before jumping into a full-blown legal battle, her lawyer suggested she try one last attempt at resolving the issue peacefully. Sometimes, he said, people respond better when you give them a chance to fix things themselves. With that advice in mind, Margaret reluctantly agreed to meet with Richard Langley, the president of the HOA. Richard was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, who always seemed to carry an air of authority. He wore pressed shirts and polished shoes, and his tone was often patronizing, as though he believed his position made him superior to everyone else. Margaret had crossed paths with him a few times at neighborhood events, but they weren't exactly friends. Still, she figured it was worth hearing him out, if only to see how far he'd go to justify what they'd done. The meeting took place in the HOA's community center, a bland room with beige walls and fluorescent lighting. A long table dominated the space, surrounded by uncomfortable plastic chairs. Margaret sat at one end, clutching her folder filled with documents, property deeds, photos of the bridge, and notes from her conversations with the HOA. Across from her, Richard leaned, back in his chair, exuding confidence. Two other board members flanked him, nodding along as he spoke. "Margaret," Richard began, his voice smooth and measured, "I understand you're upset about the bridge, but let me assure you, this decision was made with the best interests of the entire community in mind. We needed a way to connect the two sides of the neighborhood, and your property happened to be the most logical location." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Logical? You mean convenient for you? Did it ever occur to you to ask me first?" Richard hesitated for a moment, then forced a smile. "We did send you a letter explaining our plans, and honestly, we assumed you'd see the benefits. This bridge improves accessibility for everyone. It's not just about us, it's about creating a stronger sense of community." "A stronger sense of community?" Margaret repeated, her voice rising slightly. "By trespassing on my land and ignoring my objections? That doesn't sound very neighborly to me." The room fell silent for a beat. Richard cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. "Look, I get that this might have been poorly communicated, but the bridge is already built. Taking it down now would cause unnecessary disruption. What if we offered you some form of compensation instead? Maybe a reduction in your HOA fees or a landscaping upgrade for your yard? Margaret stared at him, incredulous. Was he serious? Offering her a discount on fees she never asked for in exchange for something far more valuable, her dignity and autonomy? She shook her head slowly, trying to keep her temper in check. This isn't about money, Richard. It's about respect. You can't just build whatever you want on someone's property and expect them to be okay with it because you throw a few perks their way. Richard frowned, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so directly. Well, if you're not willing to compromise, I'm afraid there's not much more we can do. The bridge is staying. Margaret clenched her fists, under the table, resisting the urge to slam them down. She had expected resistance, but this level of arrogance was infuriating. Still, she reminded herself why she was here, to find a solution, no matter how slim the chances seemed. Fine, she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. If you won't remove the bridge voluntarily, I'll have no choice but to pursue legal action. And trust me, I'll make sure the whole neighborhood knows exactly what's going on. The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Richard's confident demeanor faltered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with another insincere smile. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, he said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. Thank you for coming, Margaret. We'll review your concerns and get back to you. As Margaret walked out of the community center, she felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, and a glimmer of satisfaction. At least she had drawn a line in the sand. If the HOA thought they could intimidate her into submission, they were sorely mistaken. But the tension between Margaret and the HOA didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, the situation grew even more complicated. Residents began using the bridge daily, treating it as though it had always been part of the neighborhood. Some even started parking their cars near Margaret's driveway to avoid walking too far. Her once pristine yard became a shortcut for joggers, dog walkers, and families pushing strollers. Each time she stepped outside, she felt like an outsider in her own home. One afternoon, while tending to her garden, Margaret noticed a young couple crossing the bridge with a baby stroller. They paused halfway to snap a selfie, laughing and chatting as though they were on vacation. Margaret approached them cautiously, holding a rake in one hand. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I just wanted to remind you that this is private property. Please be mindful of where you're walking." The couple looked surprised, almost offended. "Oh, we didn't know," the woman replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "The HOA said it was fine." Margaret sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Yes, well, the HOA doesn't own this land. I do. So please, try to stay on the path and clean up after yourselves." The couple nodded awkwardly and hurried off, but Margaret knew the message wouldn't stick. Most people wouldn't care enough to change their behavior. To them, the bridge was simply a convenience, a way to shave a few minutes off their commute. They didn't see the bigger picture, the ripple effect of their actions on someone else's life. Despite the growing resentment, Margaret tried to focus on the positives. She spent extra time in her garden, planting new flowers and trimming bushes to reclaim a sense of control. She invited her sister over for tea, finding comfort in familiar company. And she stayed in close contact with her lawyer, gathering evidence and preparing for the possibility of a lawsuit. Though the situation weighed heavily on her, she refused to let it break her spirit. Still, the question lingered in the back of her mind. How far would the HOA go to defend their decision? Would they admit their mistake and dismantle the bridge, or would they dig in their heels and escalate the conflict? Margaret didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was certain. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a boiling point. Margaret's warnings and protests seemed to fall on deaf ears, and the HOA appeared determined to act as if nothing was wrong. The bridge stood firm, or at least it seemed that way. People continued to use it daily, treating it like just another part of the community infrastructure. Children played near the creek, couples strolled hand in hand, and joggers pounded across its wooden planks without a second thought. To them, it was convenient, practical, even charming. But beneath its surface, cracks were beginning to show. Both, literally and figuratively. One sunny Saturday morning, the HOA held its monthly gathering at the park adjacent to Margaret's property. It was an event designed to bring neighbors together, complete with picnic tables laden with food, colorful balloons tied to trees, and cheerful chatter filling the air. Richard Langley, ever the showman, decided this was the perfect opportunity to showcase the new bridge. He gathered a small crowd of board members and curious residents near the structure, beaming with pride as though he'd personally built it himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation, "I'd like to draw your attention to this wonderful addition to our community, the footbridge connecting us all. Not only does it provide easier access to the park, but it also symbolizes unity and cooperation. Let's take a moment to appreciate what we've accomplished together." Margaret watched from her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had seen the group gathering earlier and knew exactly what was coming. Her jaw tightened as Richard gestured dramatically toward the bridge, inviting everyone to follow him across it. A handful of HOA board members stepped forward, eager to join the demonstration. Cameras clicked as they posed for photos, smiling broadly as though they were celebrities cutting a ribbon at a grand opening. Margaret couldn't help but roll her eyes. Unity, cooperation. Those words felt hollow when the bridge had been forced onto her property against her will. Still, she stayed silent, observing from a distance. Something about the scene made her uneasy. Not just the blatant disregard for her rights, but the way the bridge looked. Even from afar, she could see that it wasn't built to last. The wood was already weathered, some planks warped and uneven. Nails jutted out at odd angles, and the supports wobbled slightly whenever someone stepped on them. It was only a matter of time before disaster struck. As the group began crossing, Margaret leaned forward, gripping the railing of her porch. She didn't want anyone to get hurt, but part of her couldn't help feeling a twinge of satisfaction at the thought of the bridge failing. Maybe then, people would finally understand the consequences of their arrogance. The first few steps went smoothly enough. Richard led the way, his confident stride masking any doubts he might have had about the structure's stability. Behind him, other board members followed, laughing and chatting as though they were on a leisurely nature walk. Then came the sound, a low groan, almost like the creak of an old door hinge. At first, no one paid much attention. Wooden bridges often made noise after all. But then the groaning grew louder, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore. Margaret's heart raced as she realized what was happening. The bridge was giving way. Time seemed to slow down as the unthinkable unfolded. One of the support beams snapped with a sharp crack, sending splinters flying into the air. The planks beneath the group's feet shifted violently, tilting downward toward the creek below. For a brief moment, everyone froze, their faces registering shock and disbelief. Then chaos erupted. Screams filled the air as Richard and several others plunged into the shallow water. Some landed awkward. The aftermath of the bridge collapse was nothing short of chaotic. The once peaceful Saturday morning had turned into a scene straight out of a slapstick comedy, or so it seemed to some onlookers who hadn't been directly involved. Richard Langley, the ever-confident HOA president, now sat dripping wet in the shallow creek, his pressed shirt and polished shoes completely ruined. Mud clung to his pants, and his usually slicked-back hair was plastered to his forehead in an unflattering mess. Around him, other board members scrambled to their feet, equally disheveled and embarrassed. Margaret stood frozen on her porch, watching the spectacle unfold. Her initial shock quickly gave way to a mix of emotions: relief that no one appeared seriously injured, disbelief at the absurdity of the situation, and a flicker of satisfaction that justice, in its own clumsy way, had been served. She wasn't proud of feeling even a hint of vindication, but after months of being ignored and disrespected, it was hard not to see the irony in the moment. As the fallen group tried to regain their composure, murmurs rippled through the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch. Some laughed nervously, unsure whether they should find the incident funny or concerning. Others whispered among themselves, speculating about what had gone wrong. "I told you that thing looked shaky," one man muttered to his wife. "It's a miracle this didn't happen sooner." Richard, however, refused to admit fault. He climbed out of the creek with as much dignity as he could muster, brushing mud off his sleeves while glaring at the remnants of the bridge. "This is unacceptable," he barked, pointing accusingly at the broken structure. "Whoever built this used substandard materials. This is clearly the contractor's fault." His attempt to shift blame fell flat. Several people exchanged skeptical glances, and Margaret couldn't help but snort under her breath. Substandard materials? The truth was far simpler. The HOA had rushed the project without proper planning or oversight, prioritizing convenience over quality. Now they were reaping the consequences of their carelessness. Despite Richard's protests, rumors began spreading almost immediately. By the time the soggy group returned to dry land, whispers had turned into outright accusations. Some residents claimed they'd seen Margaret inspecting the bridge earlier that week, implying she might have tampered with it. Others suggested she had hired someone to sabotage the structure in retaliation for the HOA's actions. These allegations infuriated Margaret, not only because they were baseless, but also because they revealed how little her neighbors trusted her. Determined to clear her name, Margaret approached the crowd, her expression calm but firm. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear," she said, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the chatter. "I had nothing to do with this. That bridge collapsed because it was poorly constructed, plain and simple. If anyone wants to point fingers, they should start with the people who decided to build it in the first place." Her words silenced the murmurs, though not everyone looked convinced. Richard, still dripping wet, shot her a glare but said nothing. Instead, he retreated to the community center with the rest of the board members, presumably to discuss damage control. Meanwhile, Margaret went back inside her house, her mind racing. She knew the collapse would only escalate the conflict between her and the HOA, and she needed to prepare for whatever came next. Over the following days, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some residents sympathized with Margaret, acknowledging that the HOA had acted recklessly by building on private property without permission. They pointed out that the bridge's poor condition was evident from the start and questioned why no one had listened to Margaret's concerns. Others, however, remained loyal to the HOA, dismissing Margaret as difficult and unreasonable. Tensions ran high, dividing the community into two camps. Margaret, unwilling to let false accusations go unchecked, decided to take matters into her own hands. She hired an independent engineer to inspect the remains of the bridge and determine exactly why it had failed. The engineer arrived a few days later, equipped with tools and a clipboard. After carefully examining the wreckage, he confirmed what Margaret already suspected. The bridge had been built using cheap, rotten wood and lacked adequate support beams. In short, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Armed with the engineer's report, Margaret filed a formal complaint against the HOA, demanding accountability for the damage done to her property and the potential danger posed to the community. She included copies of the inspection findings, along with photos documenting the state of her yard before and after the bridge's construction. Her lawyer advised her to remain patient, as legal battles often took time, but Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in months, she believed she might actually win this fight. The HOA, on the other hand, scrambled to save face. Richard called an emergency meeting to address the situation, though his usual confidence had noticeably waned. He announced that the HOA would cover the costs of dismantling the remaining parts of the bridge and restoring Margaret's property to its original state. He also promised to review all future projects more thoroughly, though many residents doubted his sincerity. Behind closed doors, tensions simmered within the board itself. Several members criticized Richard for mishandling the situation, and whispers of a leadership change began to circulate. For Margaret, the apology, even if half-hearted, wasn't enough. Yes, the HOA had finally acknowledged their mistake, but the damage had already been done. Her once pristine yard was scarred with tire tracks and litter, and her relationship with her neighbors had been irreparably strained. Trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt. Still, she refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she focused on reclaiming her space and proving that she wouldn't be pushed around. She spent hours cleaning up the debris left behind by the bridge's collapse, enlisting the help of her sister and a few close friends. Together, they replanted flowers, repaired sections of her fence, and restored order to her garden. Each small victory brought her a step closer to regaining the peace she had fought so hard to protect. Though the process was exhausting, it gave her a sense of control, a reminder that she was still the master of her own destiny. As weeks turned into months, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be under the circumstances. The remnants of the bridge were removed, leaving only faint traces of its existence. The HOA avoided mentioning the incident publicly, hoping it would fade from memory. But for Margaret, the experience had changed her forever. She learned valuable lessons about standing up for herself, seeking justice, and refusing to compromise her values, even when faced with overwhelming opposition. Though the battle was far from easy, Margaret emerged stronger and more determined than ever. And while she couldn't undo the past, she could move forward with the knowledge that she had fought for what was right, and won. The final chapter of Margaret's battle with the HOA unfolded not with a bang, but with a quiet resolution that felt both satisfying and bittersweet. After months of legal back and forth, countless meetings, and endless stress, the court finally ruled in her favor. The judge's decision was clear. The HOA had violated Margaret's property rights by constructing the bridge without permission, and they were ordered to dismantle any remaining parts of the structure, restore her land to its original condition, and pay substantial damages for the harm caused. For Margaret, the verdict was more than just a legal win. It was validation. All those sleepless nights spent poring over documents, all the times she'd felt dismissed or belittled by her neighbors, had led to this moment. She stood in the courtroom as the ruling was announced, her hands clasped tightly together, fighting back tears. It wasn't joy she felt, not exactly, but a deep sense of relief. Finally, someone had listened. Finally, someone had acknowledged that what happened to her was wrong. But even as the legal battle came to an end, the emotional toll lingered. Margaret returned home to find her yard still bearing the scars of the ordeal. Though the bridge was gone, the ground near the creek remained uneven where heavy machinery had churned up the soil. Her flower beds, once vibrant and colorful, were now patchy and sparse. Even worse, the relationship between her and her neighbors had shifted in ways that couldn't easily be undone. Some residents began avoiding her altogether, crossing the street when they saw her coming, or pretending not to notice her waves. Others continued to whisper behind her back, questioning whether she'd really tampered with the bridge despite the evidence proving otherwise. A few brave souls tried to mend fences, literally and figuratively, by offering to help replant her garden or bringing over baked goods as a gesture of goodwill. But no matter how kind their intentions, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same. Determined to reclaim her sanctuary, Margaret threw herself into restoring her property. With the compensation awarded by the court, she hired a professional landscaper to revitalize her yard. New flowers sprouted alongside the creek, their bright petals swaying gently in the breeze. Shrubs were planted strategically to create a natural barrier between her land and the rest of the neighborhood, and most importantly, she installed a tall wooden fence along her property line, a physical reminder that her space was hers alone. The changes brought a renewed sense of peace, though it came at a cost. Margaret realized she could never fully trust her neighbors again. Gone were the days when she'd leave her front door unlocked or invite people over for casual chats. Instead, she kept to herself, finding solace in solitude. Her home became a fortress, a place where she could retreat from the world and focus on the things that truly mattered to her: her books, her garden, and the quiet rhythm of nature. Meanwhile, the HOA underwent its own transformation. Richard Langley resigned as president shortly after the trial, unable to withstand the mounting criticism from board members and residents alike. His departure marked the beginning of a new era for the organization, one defined by caution and accountability. Future projects required unanimous approval from affected homeowners, and contractors were held to higher standards. While some viewed these changes as necessary improvements, others saw them as overcorrections born out of fear of another scandal. Years passed, and the memory of the infamous bridge collapse faded into local legend. Newcomers to the neighborhood often asked about the empty stretch of land near the creek, curious why there was no bridge connecting the two sides. Longtime residents would exchange knowing glances before launching into hushed retellings of the story, each version slightly exaggerated for dramatic effect. Some painted Margaret as a stubborn troublemaker who refused to play nice, while others portrayed her as a hero who stood up to an overbearing authority. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Margaret herself rarely spoke about the incident. When pressed, she offered only brief, matter-of-fact responses. It was a difficult time, she'd say with a shrug, but I learned a lot about standing my ground. To her, the past was best left undisturbed, like the calm surface of the creek that flowed through her property. She preferred to focus on the present, the way sunlight filtered through the trees in her backyard, the sound of birdsong in the early morning, the simple pleasure of tending to her garden. Yet, every so often, she allowed herself a small smile when she thought about the collapse, not because she enjoyed seeing others fail, but because it reminded her of her own resilience. She had faced adversity head-on and emerged victorious, proving that sometimes the quietest voices can make the loudest impact. The bridge may have fallen, but Margaret's spirit remained unshaken. In the end, the story of the ill-fated bridge served as a lesson for everyone involved. For the HOA, it underscored the importance of transparency, communication, and respect for individual rights. For the neighbors, it highlighted the dangers of blindly following authority without considering the consequences. And for Margaret, it reinforced the value of perseverance, integrity, and self-respect. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margaret reflected on everything she had been through. Her life was quieter now, simpler, yet infinitely richer. She had fought for her home, for her dignity, and for the right to live on her own terms. And though the scars of the past would always remain, they were a testament to her strength, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, she had refused to give up. The creek murmured softly in the background, its waters flowing steadily, as they always had. Life moved on as it always does. But for Margaret Harper, the woman who stood her ground against an entire community, the future looked brighter than ever.